this is the most important part of the weekend in that it's about sharing sort of what you went through, your lessons learned, what you're showing, but it's about talking not just about what worked, but really what didn't work. So when you come up here, if you just kind of think about that, and there's no rush, this is the discussion that matters. We're gonna have a quick sort of circle discussion afterward where we can talk a bit more, you know, about those things. But when you come up, do that. And then if anybody has questions for each group, maybe just hold on to them until the end. But let's have time for that as well so that we can help each other sort of think through some stuff. But maybe if you aim to talk for like, you know, 5, 6, 7, something like that minutes, 10 minutes if you want, but like that kind of stuff. Don't feel rushed, okay? That's the point. This is not, we have the what do you call it? We have the opportunity here to have good time to actually talk about all the stuff you went through. So, and if I have questions, I might just help to kind of push you to answer some of those questions. Cool? So I think we should go from, how's it going over here?
It's good.
It's good? You picking a group?
Open disparities and immigrant settlements.
That's yours? How do you feel about going first? I know you just started eating. You good? Okay.
So I might need you guys to throw in some details as I can hear it.
For sure. You should all come up, ideally. Yeah, everybody should come up. Yeah. You'll eat after. You'll eat after. Come on. We all want to be able to talk. Yeah? Okay. They'll be fine. Letting go of the... You'll be fine. Okay.
Thanks. So we kind of just patched together this title quickly. The theme of what we're looking at is why is Canada doing a bad job at integrating newcomers into Canada? So we're kind of, most of our research was based around that. So we did some preliminary research where we put together already found data that kind of shows the potentials for difficulties with newcomers, as well as evidence that shows that you know, immigrants maybe have abilities but are facing difficult situations. So here's just a couple of the things that we found. First, it's economic indicators for recent immigrants and Canadian-born. So rates of unemployment. You can see that there's a much higher rate of unemployment for recent immigrants. However, if we look through, hold on. Here, we are putting together data that is trying to, we haven't gotten it all sorted out yet, but we're putting together data that is showing that immigrants actually have a higher amount of education levels in comparison to you know, the general Canadian population. As well, we were trying to show the kind of different immigrants that come into Canada to dispel some of the myths that people have about who we're bringing in, what education levels, what kind of refugees they are. No, sorry, what kind of immigrants they are. So, you know, here we show we have a lot of the planned people that we want to bring in is going to be economic, and then family, and then other types, including refugees, protected persons, etc. So we were going to maybe put this into more clear visualizations in graphics. We wanted to talk about economic scarring, which is kind of the idea that when people come in during times of recession, that can adversely affect their long-term potential for employment. And then so we were just finding evidence of this, and then we were going to go on from that to talk about the implications that could have for our analysis of immigrant employment and job opportunities for them. Here we're also trying to talk about, this actually just came out in the Toronto Star, I think it was yesterday or the day before. It's a map that kind of shows how where you land as an immigrant matters as well. And then so where people establish themselves within the Greater Toronto area has a big impact on what income they'll have or their access to jobs. So this is just our first step into that research. So do you want to take it from this part? Yeah.
Yes, so as mentioned, the interest was really to try to get at two things. One was to, first of all, make the point with data that there are disparities that newcomers face when they come to Canada. And yesterday when we were talking about it, we went over sort of the different dimensions of disparities. So for example, immigrants to Canada tend to have higher educational status, but once they come to Canada, health status, I was going to say. Once they come to Canada, their health status declines and it converges more with the Canadian average. So we're really interested in getting at some of those points. And like mentioned, immigrants tend to have higher educational achievement or status compared with Canadian born, but in Canada experience higher rates of poverty. So that was the one piece, which is really just to speak to what the data shows. And then we wanted to get the causes of that. So that was more of looking at what the evidence says, because we realized that using a dashboard of current census data or even service data would not really make that point. And so we were looking at the literature. So for example, there have been studies by StatCan that have looked at things like when people settle in Canada that have identified, as mentioned, that there's this kind of process of economic scarring if people enter Canada during a recessionary period. There are studies that talk about what's called the healthy immigrant effect, which really speaks to the point about immigrant health over time when people come to Canada, and there's other studies. So we really want to take those bullet points and develop an infographic from that, which is a to-do on our list. And that's basically it. We wanted to sort of just have something that at a glance would show folks what are the drivers behind disparities, and then it would open up conversation for communities to try to address that.
We also wanted to, we're also doing some research as well. We were trying to look at, did you want to explain it, or did you like, okay. Yeah, and it's about where you settle as well in terms of what cities. Is there an issue with a bias towards like going to Toronto as opposed to, are there actually opportunities outside? So,
thank you. Another factor that causes unemployment in the Toronto area is the fact that most immigrants, when they come, they are not really aware of what is happening outside the GTA. For example, in a place like Peterborough or London or Kingston. So what I did was, using the same set of data, I extrapolated information. And if you look at the graph, I extrapolated information, and we also found that the major sources of immigration were from India and China. So using that as a sample, I extrapolated information across 4 locations. One in the east, Kingston; in the west, London; downtown Toronto; and central Peterborough. And what I found was very surprising, that the majority of immigrants chose to settle in Toronto. On the other hand, there were jobs available in a place like Kingston, London, and Peterborough. So the conclusion that I draw from this is that people tend to cluster or stay in one location, perhaps out of a comfort level. They are not willing to go out of their comfort zone. That some awareness needs to happen for people to push out and perhaps get jobs. But we need to get more information about the type of work available. But that is a starting point for further analysis.
So just to be clear, like, we do have this information that was drawn about where people are settling. However, this is just like a theoretical graph of what it would look like in terms of what are the employment opportunities in these other cities. So we're still trying to find ways to scrape the data about what are the job possibilities and openings in the other cities around there in order to draw that conclusion. And that could kind of lend to what we're saying as well in terms of how the federal government thinks about settling new people versus municipal and provincial levels. Yeah, so that's it for us. What we have, it's kind of scraped together, but we're slowly moving through it. Thank you.
Don't go. Any questions? I have a question, but does anybody else have a question first? The health, can you talk a little bit more about the health disparity and sort of where did that come from to think about that, or what data were you using to consider that? Because that's a story I haven't heard much about.
Yeah, so it seems to be a story that a lot of Canadians haven't heard about, and researchers have called it the healthy immigrant effect. It's basically what's found in data when you look at the health status of immigrants in their first year versus after they've been here for a few years. And it's a pretty established issue. You see worsening health in terms of mental health and also physical health. We didn't really look at the data per se, but it's something that's in the research literature. So we would, if we were to develop an infographic, we would cite the appropriate studies that really speak to that and get at that. I guess in terms of like, as a data point, a lot of people ask the question, why does that happen? And that's the open question that researchers are working on. So there's some sort of insights as to what's happening, discrimination, experiences of discrimination in Canada for folks that are maybe coming from a middle-class background that in Canada have their socioeconomic status sort of overturned. For them, it might be very stressful as well, and that can lead to it. Adopting the Canadian diet or Canadian habits can also be part of it. So really what's happening is that a new population coming into a society are having their health status converge with the average, right? With what the norm is here. So, but
I guess from like a journalism lens, like does that story, were you thinking about that one in any way like that you haven't, I don't know. It's just not one I really never hear that discussion like kind of bubble up. So did you have any thoughts about that as a storytelling piece or like how to combat maybe other narratives or anything around that?
Look enough research. I mean, I think if people were to know that actually there's adverse health effects to coming to Canada, that would definitely be a news piece. I just have to really find stories about that actually happening and like maybe figure out, is it differing for different kind of communities and why? So with more research, and if I knew, you know, what it looked like on the ground and we could have better conclusions about why it's happening, that could potentially be a really very interesting story for people. Because that goes against what people usually would think. They think, oh, you come to Canada and like you have the health care, then you actually start doing a lot better, and then, you know, you integrate into our systems, and then like you become, you know, it just goes against the average thought. So that storytelling-wise is a very clear story.
I'm going to step in it here because I can't remember the name of the people that this story was about, but I just read something recently about, like, you know, because there's a cultural element to, say, mental health support. Oh, and this was a discussion about how in this culture, there wasn't even language around trauma. Right? So it was like you couldn't even just stick somebody in a room and say, like, okay, well, we're supporting you by providing services. It was actually like a much longer and harder road.
Yeah, I think I haven't done enough research into mental health issues and cross-cultural mental health, but I think that would be something that's really important to look at if it's not already being looked at in terms of the cultural paradigms around it as well and the cultural barriers to addressing it. So. Yeah, that would be very relevant, especially to Toronto as a story.
Yeah, that sounds like one. You guys were on a lot of stuff. Okay, anybody else have any other questions that sort of conversation prompted? You got one, Ileana?
I just have a comment. Yeah,
Okay.
the comment is I read that report, and it's Ontario report came out, I guess, in May, June, but from the policy perspective, I remember they were saying it's a 6 years is this critical period. So you have to 5 to 6 years. They have 5 to 6 years for their health, including mental health, to get worse. But in that period, if we provide different type of services, we are able to catch up, and especially if we work with youth, that would be important critical period. That's all.
Okay, yeah, let's look at that.
Okay, good. That's a good next step on some of this stuff. Great. Well, thanks again. Nice work, everybody. Okay. Now you can eat some more food. So next up, Deanna, you want to go? Yeah, perfect.
You have it here?
It's on the key, but I'm going to use my computer to talk.
Okay. Yeah.
So no, because it's on the key here. I don't know how to. Yeah, how do I get? No, I need Word. Yes, please. Just pull up the Word document.
Why don't you want to just connect and she just...
It's already in.
It's here.
I already have everything. Which one?
It's in Zoya. These pics.
And do you want to zoom in?
Yeah, do full screen, I guess.
You can't for Word docs.
Yeah, just
Maybe
oh, you can
you can just like pop out like this.
yeah. Okay, that's okay. It's good enough.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, so and then here's the Here, I'm just gonna. Make sure I don't trip and fall on this thing. Thanks. So I can just talk on this thing. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm essentially the last man standing from the group yesterday. Sherry's over there. So what I did was take the data, the interpretation data from MCIS that we had pulled. But what I found is that the data only encompasses the funded interpretation assignments from April 2016 to September 2017 and only shows Tamil, Arabic, and Hungarian. So the data pull I felt was subjective and may not necessarily tell the whole story. It's based on assumptions that those three languages were the most frequently requested in the funded services, which encompasses domestic violence, homelessness, elder abuse, and human trafficking. So as this data set doesn't include all other languages, it's difficult to know whether these three languages are in fact the top requested languages for funded services in the area that we service. But from the data set, I worked with it, and it can be noted that the requests for funded services in these three languages from over a 15-month period from April 2016 to September 2017 have been the highest for Arabic, which I really, I don't think that's a surprise to any one of us here. The most requests have come in the spring and summer months, and over this period, requests for Arabic have been consistently higher and continue to grow. As you can see, Tamil, which is the red, has continued to grow as well. And the number of requests for funded services in these three languages alone have almost doubled from the same time period in 2016. So based on the first three digits of postal code from the postal codes from each of the 4,000 requests in the time frame, the location of these requests seems to be focused not only on the GTA, but more specifically in Toronto. So we can see that the saturation of blue is Arabic, and by far the blue circles outweigh the orange and the red, and they're also primarily in West Toronto. So what was wrong with my initial data? Nothing. But based on my experience at Homeless Connect Toronto last weekend, I feel that there may be something else out there. For example, in a 2-hour period at Homeless Connect TO, we had more requests for Mandarin interpretation for older women than for any other languages, including Arabic. In fact, there were no requests for Arabic at all while I was there. So this leads me to believe that we need to pull all the funded requests data set in the same time period so we can see the whole picture. The current data set may in fact be accurate in that it is the languages most frequently requesting funded services, but without the rest of the data, we can't be sure. And it would be also helpful to take a more profound look at the immigration stats for other languages and see if there's a growing trend. We know that there currently is a very large number of Arabic-speaking newcomers, but what we don't know is the number of Mandarin and other language-speaking older persons who have never learned English and who are also in vulnerable situations in our community. So a lesson I've learned is that sometimes you just work with what you have. Just because you don't feel the data set is complete does not mean that there isn't something worth exploring. So, thank you.
Those are good lessons. Agree. You got more pictures?
Yeah, Alex showed me how to pull this chart. So
Yeah, tell us.
Alex showed me how to pull this Ontario municipality chart through a shapefile and some slick maneuvering in Tableau. But that's really all I've been able to do with Tableau.
That's a good start. So you kind of talk about like a data quality issue, I think, right? And so can you speak a little bit more about like the stuff that was in your brain going like, I think I might be missing stuff here? Like what was keeping you critical of what you had? Is it your experience? Was it Like, what was helping you know that there might be problems with what you had?
Because in my experience last weekend with Homeless Connect TO,
Can you explain a little more about that experience? Because I don't know what it is.
So Homeless Connect TO was an event held last weekend at the Mattamy Center at Ryerson, and it's an occasion where vulnerable populations in the city can come and access free services, so haircuts, community services, Service Ontario, language services. And MCIS had a number of interpreters there providing language services. And the demand for Mandarin was, in my opinion, a lot higher than all the rest of the languages while I was there anyway. There were about 6 requests for Mandarin, and they were all older women who had very, very limited English-speaking skills. And I thought, for me, that was kind of a red flag, I guess, that neither Mandarin nor Cantonese showed up on our list of funded services. And then I realized what was only the 3 languages that were pulled, and kind of based on the assumption that these would be the top 3 languages requesting funded services in, I guess, the areas that MCIS provides services. So I kind of realized that yesterday there could be a gap, but without having the full extent of the data in the same time period, all the languages, all the services, all the requests, we won't know. So it was kind of a learning point for me that this is what, we need to do. Maybe it is accurate. Maybe it is the top 3 languages, but without being able to see the rest of the data, I can't make,
Can I make a point?
For sure.
I think one of the issues that it also highlights is that section or segment of the population is not covered under funding.
Exactly.
So they're not actually being, there's no grant programs that actually cover funding for that section of the population, which is an older, women, vulnerable population. Because the way we define domestic violence victims or shelter recipients is very specific, so it leaves a lot of vulnerable people out.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about proximity to services. Like, is that an element that comes up in terms of, people, were people coming to this because they lived near it, and then this was like this little time of a pop-up moment where they could get help? Is that an issue that's sort of talked about in terms of like how people can get to service? Is that a thing that is discussed? This is also new to me, the whole concept of like how there's access to these services.
I'm not sure.
Not sure, right?
I don't know that there's been a lot of discussion around it. There may be, but
right. Because I'm thinking of that neighborhood, and if you said it was at Ryerson, like then we've got a just natural proximity of where people live, right, to the event. So that's like I don't. Does everybody know what community hubs are? Is that a thing that people in here are familiar with? So it's this one thing that's being discussed, particularly as schools are coming into. As real estate holdings, they're in some cases maybe being sold. One of the discussions is how do you keep land, how do you keep schools and then turn them into other stuff? And as far as community services go, I think translation is an interesting one that I don't know. Like at Bloor and Dufferin, there's a discussion going on right now about a hub. So the province is there and all the community partners are there. But I wonder if, or if anybody doing this kind of work is there, because it's an interesting layer that if you don't know about this, you think, yes, you're putting a thing there, but if people can't access it because of language.
I don't think that's the issue per se. I mean, you're right in that there's no coordinated approach to addressing the language access issue. That's one thing. The other thing is based on certain, for historical reasons, certain grant programs have continued on for years on end, and nobody has gone back to reassess and see, okay, is there a wider population that needs to be covered under this grant? And why are we just continuing to fund this narrow stream? Because our population has evolved and become so diverse over the last years, but it hasn't been acknowledged in the granting streams. So
right. Is that a thing
I think that's probably why.
Right, and is that something that like at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, or is there any like place where that discussion could
there
live?
might be.
Okay.
I think what is also happening is the government wants to get out of the business of providing grants. So what they do instead is give money to different agencies to purchase language services. So we bid on contracts, and so we have Band-Aid solutions in terms of covering under different programs, but it's not coordinated. There's a lot of duplication, and there's a lot of gaps.
Can I put you on the spot for a minute, Sherry? Is that right? Can I? Well, just about, as I have a particular thinking about journalism and the narrative kind of piece of this story. Like, was working with this kind of data, is just any high-level observations or like stuff that you learned from like how these things might come out as stories? Like any sort of comment that you want to share from like how you think about storytelling? Or whatever you want to say on it. Like, I just think you come from a different.
Okay. Well, for me personally, I find that a lot of the information that I usually work with, so they're not usually raw data. So I very rarely ever am given like a spreadsheet and told, find the story in this. So usually what happens is somebody has already analyzed the information, and and from that, I get kind of the story from that, because I already hear from someone else. And like a lot of journalism doesn't focus on, like the numbers themselves. It's about focusing on the people in the stories and like the representation of the statistics in a person, so that you can connect it on a personal level to people who would be interested in that. So for me, like looking at these numbers was very hard. I couldn't really understand it in a way that would help me connect to it, but I think like putting them in the visuals, like working through Tableau really helped with that. Other than that, I just found like numbers really hard to work with. I mean, I'm in journalism for a reason. I don't really work with numbers.
But that's a perfect example of like why cross collaboration works. Like I would also, am I right to assume that talking it through between the two of you did help a bit? Is that something, or maybe you guys weren't talking to each other? This is like.
We didn't really work on it a ton yesterday on the actual.
Can you use a mic?
We didn't really work a lot with the raw data yesterday. It was more trying to figure out the visuals. So I think they're, yeah.
Okay, cool. That insight to me is something we're going to come back to, I think, when we all talk, because that is kind of at the heart of this whole event in a way, is how to manage that thing. And a lot of what you said makes sense, and is what's good about journalism. Is you're not looking for numbers for a story, you're looking for a story, right? And then, okay, cool. Anybody else have any questions for Deanna or Sherry? Yes, Howard, you got one? Yeah. I'll bring you a mic. I think it just helps. No problem. Beep, beep, beep.
Clarification question. Like just the context of why you pulled only those 3 data points as opposed to anything else? Like, does the database not include anything else? Is that why?
I will ask my colleague Hidayat, who is right in front of you.
Oh,
He's the master of our data.
Hello. Okay. So the reason for this data pull was this whole story is about migration and immigrants. So we wanted to show or highlight these 3 languages related to immigration: Arabic and Tamil and Hungarian. That's the reason of this data pull. Yeah. Thanks. Do you have other data points too? Yes, we do have. Yes.
Yeah, we'll be able to pull all of them going forward. But I think for the purposes of this weekend, to keep it a little bit more succinct, because it could get out of control with a number of languages. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, guys. Right. Okay, in group 3, we're going to bring lots of you up here, a couple of you up here. What's the plan? Everybody can come if you want to. Somebody? Anybody? You good? It's okay. We can go back to them for questions if they don't want to come to the front. It's no problem.
Thank you. I have a very supportive group.
No shade. No shade.
Okay, so I just remembered that I have to pull up our visual. Hold on a second.
I'm walking over like I can help you, but it's not true. Maybe. Group 1, you got it.
I'm sorry, Inta, which one is?
Okay, you look like you're good.
Question, the third has all of the images combined?
No, the first one has
Okay. Okay. So I'm actually very happy that we are right after Diana because our raw material was the same data. So we are working with the same numbers and the same kind of categories. However, we decided to filter our focus on funded programs for domestic violence, for victims of domestic violence. And we realized that when we were surfing the data and trying to figure out the number of requests and try to compare it to the status of the assignments of whether or not it was fulfilled, canceled, or if the victim, otherwise known as the client, was a no-show, we actually found some interesting materials. And we decided to put all of that information into 2 different buckets. And all we could do, because of the limitations that we were also facing with the data, was to raise some questions and sort of make some suggestions of how we can find the answers to those questions. And I think we got really interested to further continue this research. But right now, what we know is that on top 3 languages, Arabic, Tamil, and Hungarian, we had a total of 3,800 requests that came in for domestic violence and victim assistant witness programs. Now, in our internal database, domestic violence court programs are programs that could be requested by police, Legal Aid Ontario, private lawyers or law firms, and also VAWP, Victim Assistant Witness Programs, are requests for interpretation that could be requested by shelters, social and community entities, and some health-related requests that usually come in by shelters, as I know. Now, what was really interesting for us was to know that 100% of what we were dealing with in terms of funded programs involved women and children. Now, because we know that MCIS is a non-for-profit that provides language barrier removal programs to vulnerable clients, it was a big question to us of why that was the case. Why are we only using the funding for women and children? Is there a problem in the fact that we haven't really measured whether or not the victims were men? Is that because we have contracts with social entities that only cover and focus on women? Is it because the fact that when you talk about immigration, women are more vulnerable because they do not necessarily speak the language? There might be a fear of deportation. There might be a financial dependency. But we also realized that when we tried to research some articles, we realized that in developing world or other countries, the reality of men being a victim of violence does exist. And there's actually some very nice data about it. For example, there are countries that are known that the number of men suffering from these type of violence are higher than other countries. So we know for all of these facts, and also based on a Canadian-based organization known as John Howard Society, we know that they do offer anger management classes requested by courts for both men and women. So in that case, we know that this type of reality really exists, but we are not sure why only women and children were under the umbrella of these programs with us. So that's something that we can definitely research on it and put it more in depth. We also noticed that there are movements going on. For example, digital events where it's a phrase is hashtagged and people talk about their experiences. And we also noticed that there are very small group of social entities trying to support violence against men, but they're not really necessarily government funded, and they all come from private fundings and just private community centers. This is also a data that we found by the census that talks about vulnerability of both female and men, and we can support the fact that the reality really exists. Now, there was another interesting factor that we realized. Is this a graph for that? No. Okay, so I think this is it. Sorry about that. So another interesting fact was that when we go back to domestic violence requests that come in, if I have to walk you through the process, usually, well, it can be different variations, but majority of the cases have the following steps. So either Children's Aid Society gets involved, and then they report that to the police, and then police tries to gather victim statements, and then a court order comes in place. Or a person goes to police directly, gives demand statement, and then Children's Aid Society gets involved, and then legal entities get involved, and somewhere between police and legal, we have women using shelters, so social enterprises and community services get involved in this area, and then they need to support themselves in terms of health and finance, and then they get counseling in terms of legal, and then they just proceed with all of that. What was interesting was that the status of the assignments that we have, for example, in Arabic, 1,474 assignments were fully fulfilled. And what does that mean in our internal data is that the interpreter was there, the client who was the victim was there, and then the service provider, it could be Legal Aid Ontario, it could be Children's Aid Society, it could be any social entity, they were also there, which is the perfect scenario here. So there was a need, and we were able to provide an answer to it. But in the same language, we also see about 13% of cancellations. Now, when we try to focus on cancellation, we realize that cancellations could be due to the fact that the service provider was no longer available on that specific date. It could be rescheduled. It could be some sort of a settlement between the two parties, so the case was settled, or it could be the fact that the victim backed out due to personal fears, due to lack of knowledge, due to lack of trust, which was really interesting to us. On the other side, we also have client no-shows. Now, knowing that client refers to victims, we know 100% that the client was not there. Now, again, these are same-day cancellations. So on the very same day that a request came in, a client was not there. It could be because someone had an accident on the way. It could be because someone was sick. Or it could be because the client was afraid of something and decided not to pursue with the case. Majority of the times, this is actually the case, which is really sad. We know that there is a demand and there is a need, and we have the interpreter to remove the language barrier. However, there is no trust either between the system and the victim or between the interpretation services and the victim that they decide to back out. So that was really, really interesting. Going back to the same data information in Tamil, we had 934 assignments that were fulfilled. 9% were canceled, presumably it was either a client backing up in prior to the actual requested day, or they got sick, or the service provider had to cancel and reschedule. And we also have 4% of no-shows. Now, when you're talking about 934 requests, 4% is a lot to me. And especially knowing that there is the need for someone to use that kind of a service in order to claim their rights, but out of fear they decide to back up. Same goes with Hungarian. Now, Hungarian had Hungarian and Tamil had the largest amount of, the lowest amount of cancellations and backups. Let's say 8.4% was canceled, and then 8.6% was client no-shows. Now, if you look close, you see that the percentage of cancellations and the percentage of client no-shows are pretty close to each other too as well. So what we want to do in the future, if we have time to get together and sort of continue this research, is to look at reports from other countries that these languages come from and see what is the status in there, how has Canada helped these families when they come to Canada, why are clients backing out, how can we build trust. And we actually decided that one good answer for building trust could be the fact that interpreters really need to do the introduction about the codes of ethics before pursuing, and at the time that they're meeting the client, that could be the first interaction, reminding them of confidentiality rules, reminding them of the fact that they're not going to remain biased, and reminding them of the fact that, yes, they might be coming from a small community and they might know each other in that community, but interpreters are definitely professionals and nothing is going to be done in terms of bridging their trust. And that's that. Do you have any questions? Someone else should have presented.
It was amazing. No way. That was really good. Thank you. I, as usual, have questions, but does anybody else have questions before I go? Anybody have questions? So my question is related to sort of, because this trust thing, I think, we've read, what was the, I'm going to look at you, the work that Robin Doolittle did this year on reported domestic violence. Yeah. I'm putting you on the spot. I'm like, you should know this. But there was an investigative report done to look at how many things were reported from women in terms of domestic violence, and it was a big study. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I'll share it on Twitter. It's really good. But basically what it surfaced was that even in the best of circumstances, we've got problems with reporting. You know, when you talk about trust, and this is old hat stuff, right? Like, we know that we have problems. So one thing, I'm connecting this to something, when I would do community consultation, I found that sometimes the best interpreters were like trusted members of the community. So you'd have kids of parents being the person at the table rather than bringing outsiders in. How is that something that you like talked about or considered in terms of, and I don't know, like, you know, this is probably a thing in your world that comes up in terms of how do you, because there is trust there, right? So how do you then maybe build on that trust? Is that something that came to mind?
That's definitely something that's missing from our raw data, but it's definitely a possibility. And I have a personal experience that I'm an interpreter for Farsi, but I usually get victim statements from Dari-speaking individuals, not because they speak Farsi fluently, and then again, let's talk about language barriers. It's because they claim that they speak Farsi because they don't want anyone from the Afghan community to be there, and they don't trust their own families too. So this is my first experience. So they claim that they speak Farsi, but maybe 60% of Dari and Farsi are equal. Even when it is, there are some words that exist in both languages but have total different meanings. For example, the word for humble could also mean poor, and that could be totally different from what it is. So, but they claim that they speak Farsi because they're really afraid that this could be a really big thing in their own community, and they do not trust any family members. They try to make it hidden as much as possible.
So it could actually be a problem, right? So it's not just a solution, it could bring on more problems.
Absolutely, it's definitely a problem. Now, same goes with men. Men can be afraid because they don't know the Canadian system, and by default, they think that they're always at fault with the Canadian system, so they don't even report. If they report, they definitely give a different version of the story.
And what's the, you mentioned maybe going through that code of ethics, like what's the gist of that code of ethics is that?
Yeah, sure. So legally, when you're interpreting in an assignment, there are 9 areas that you have to bring it to the attention of both the service provider and the client. One of them is definitely confidentiality. It's the fact that you're going to remain unbiased, the fact that you're not going to add or omit anything from the conversation, the fact that you're interpreting everything in first person, just so you are not really giving an assumption of what the person is saying, and also the fact that you are going to take notes to refresh your memory, and then you can hand it to the police or the lawyer if they like to just add that to the file. I'm missing one. Confidentiality. Oh, and the fact that you are going to remain professional at all times, and the fact that you are going to make your services accessible to the both parties, and make sure that you're interpreting everything that you're hearing. For example, if a service provider answers a phone, because we assume that if the client was an English-speaking client would hear and understand everything, you have to still continue to interpret to make sure that there's no language barrier at all until they tell you not to do that.
Right, okay. Question, yeah, or comment, or here I come with the mic. That was a really good recount, thank you. This is so interesting.
Well, I didn't want to add to the conversation that you made and to the question that Bianca spoke about. I guess it is more a question of cultural barriers. The fact that men and women have different statuses in their own countries. And by default, women have the lower hand, so to speak. They are always at the receiving end. They tend to suffer back home. So when they come to Canada, for them, it's like a culture shock. And they're experiencing freedom to do what they like. And quite often, it is the men or the women who try to prevent that from happening. And which is why we have a victim of domestic violence occurring. And having an interpreter who is neutral, is able to relate to the conversation in an unbiased manner, so that the real story comes out and allows the other party to express themselves freely, which otherwise would not happen. So that's the real story, and I can relate to those. I'm not sure if you know about what happened in Kingston 2 or 3 years ago. There was a couple from an Afghan community who had 3 children. The first son was older and had gone to university. I think it was Queen's University. He had a huge culture shock. And he was just like any Western teenager, going out with friends, sleepovers, drugs, dating, stuff like that. So the parents didn't like it. So they gave a lot of inhibitions to the son, who in turn began to suffer in studies. The son did not feel comfortable in talking to anybody, including his own brothers and sisters. As a result, what happened? He had a mental health and he committed suicide. He jumped into Lake Ontario near Kingston. Fortunately, they were able to revive him in time. And when the real story came out, they used a domestic violence interpreter to try and move him away from that atmosphere. So I just wanted to throw it out there, just for your reference.
Actually, that's very important. I think mental health is also very important here because in some cultures it's offensive to report mental health, and a lot of domestic violence actually occurs as a result of mental health. So that's also something that we need to consider when we're continuing our research, for sure.
Absolutely. And what about building, like when I think about, you could hear that whole code of ethics and still be thinking, yeah, okay, whatever, right? Like you could be hearing it and be like, yeah, that's of course what they say. What about evidence for people who would be using a service? Like, is there any thought around like, here's some people, I don't know, what am I thinking of? Testimonials almost, like, is there a way for the people within the community to confirm like, yes, indeed, I used this thing and it was okay?
That sounds like a very good idea. The only thing is it's a very tough subject matter that we are talking about, because you can't really get a testimonial from a victim saying how happy they were with a service, Right. You don't want to put them in the spotlight. Unfortunately, all you have is numbers. The numbers are definitely shaking. We're definitely missing a lot of important information. So maybe this is a good story to be told by someone doing a really in-depth research, and by them getting the trust from the service providers to shadow these sessions and report what they see. Because you can't really go to the victims, but you can definitely depend on reporters.
Or maybe, like, I always think about reviews, like, is there a way to anonymize review? I just always think about, can you get evidence into the hands of the people using the service, right? Like, and it may not be possible.
I guess you were
but
the
it's-
expert on that. You need to teach us.
no, when we talk about trust with data, I think this is a persistent theme. And any time you talk about data, you've got this thing about trust.
Yeah.
And so trying to think about mechanisms around.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
like being able to trust the data and why do you trust it
Absolutely.
and where did it come from? So wow, there's a lot of stuff in there.
I mean,
Okay.
definitely storytelling is more trust building than just giving out numbers. So maybe that's the start. But I would also like to see a reporter trying to cover different stories in different settings and report what they see and what's lacking.
Yeah, and I wonder if reporting on this whole, you know, when we talk about newcomers' experience in Canada, like I've never read a story at a high level about interpretation and the role it plays, right? So I don't know if that's, and they're like always eyeballing journalism students. Like how do you twist that into a story that helps us? Yeah, Sherry, how do you help us know those things? I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Anybody want to? Adam, you got anything? Like in terms of like how would you bring this issue up to something that someone could get, you know, start to think about this whole issue as a layer of quality of life when you come to Canada? Like anything? Interpretation in particular? Yeah, it's because there's so many things in it, trust, ethics, right? Like all that stuff. Anything? Like you can riff here, you can make it up and you can say, no, I have no idea.
Well, what do you feel like is the most compelling aspect for you, the part that you think needs to be said?
As an interpreter?
Yeah.
I think, well, I've worked with police, I've worked with Legal Aid Ontario, I've worked with social entities. It feels like social entities are the best best go-tos in order to building trust. So there is less that you can do with police, there's less than you can do with Legal Aid Ontario because they have strict protocols that they need to follow. But when you go to shelters or when you go to social entities, they can definitely advocate for us. They can definitely educate the person not only about the rights, but also about how they can trust the language barrier service providers, for them to feel at home, for them to feel safe. Maybe that would be nice. Maybe MCIS could definitely pair up with those social entities. This is just my personal belief. I think if MCIS does it solo, it would be really interesting, but it would also look like we're trying to present our services. But if social entities would help and they would bring a pool of service providers, MCIS and other organizations, then that would definitely build trust.
Like Legal Aid Ontario or
other language solution companies. I mean, we are non-for-profit. I know that there are some private language solutions. If we are all together, if we all work together instead of working as separate entities, that would also definitely reach a goal.
So what's the main problem to be addressed with it, though? Like, what's the big demand here for that would be met by coming together over this?
I can only speak as an interpreter and as someone who works for a language solution company. I think this question is better asked from a victim and their experience, to be honest with you. I think I've said as much as I know, but I think a victim's perspective is what's missing here.
And maybe this is a perfect kind of question to, great answer, by the way. It's always tempting to weigh in where no. This might be a great point for us all to organize around and start to talk about this, because I think one thing that is the theme here is how do we surface some of these issues, period? Like I can tell you, I've worked around issues for years, and the role of an interpreter in all of the different communities I've been in, I can't believe it hasn't come up, right? Like it just doesn't seem to, but then there's a huge access piece to services related to interpretation. So I think generally from a reader, understanding that this is a problem that's not even captured in any data, right? When you talk about access to services, I think how many people aren't access, never mind trust, like straight up people can't communicate with the service provider.
Right.
So where does that land, right? Like this is it's one of these big invisible stories because there's not data around it, I would say, or enough stories, then it's missing from like big narratives.
Yeah.
So
definitely,
maybe we can think about that a bit.
And it's the interpreters. I mean, you are definitely a human being at the time of need when somebody needs you. So thinking that the victim is definitely the vulnerable person here, because of the codes of ethics, I've seen interpreters fully ignoring the person because you can't really be biased and you have to make sure that you're not really bonding with any of the entities. But you can definitely make sure that you have a nice body language. You can ask them if they've ever used any services before. If they haven't, you can tell them that, okay, so it's best for us to not chit chat because, you know what, I want to remain indifferent to your situation, not indifferent, I want to remain unbiased to your situation and unbiased to the service providers. I'm just your shadow, so accept me as your shadow, and I promise everything you say, I'll say. So instead of saying those 9 clauses in that very cold kind of a way, I always tell them a story about that, how I want to help, and me taking a step back is actually a great help to you, instead of being indifferent to their situation.
Okay, yeah, because it just seems like if people hear the word, translation, interpretation, it's a very, it's just a very basic skill, and it's like almost apolitical in a way. Like it should be unbiased. It's just like a basic, communication A to B, right?
Yep.
But I think adding context to that is maybe the part. Like
Yep.
it's just that's why people don't see it.
Yep.
Does that sound?
Yeah, absolutely. Because even in our training, they told us that you're a machine who needs to just say whatever you hear, but I don't believe in that. We're all humans. I don't have to put in my opinions in order not to be a machine, but I can build trust by my body language and tell the person that, okay, so I'm you. And whenever they cry, my voice changes for them to know that I'm not an indifferent person saying that, yes, I was suffering from this. Or whenever they yell and they say, I'm so angry, I wouldn't say, yes, I'm so angry. I would mimic the same body language for them to feel safe.
But the challenge with that is usually when somebody wants or needs an interpreter, they don't merely need you to interpret the language, but it's probably a cultural thing as well, to interpret that for the person. And there are also incidents in which the interpreter is not always doing their job. I've worked with some immigrant women, and their issues were like, the interpreter's like, listen, you're just an immigrant, so you just do what these people tell you to do. So the idea that an interpreter is not unbiased and that we should all view them as that is actually extremely dangerous for the person needing those services.
That's true, but I guess if we're talking about the risks, it's less risk for you to not give any advice and try to keep your distance, but be very human about it, than to provide advice. And also, culture is definitely the tip of the iceberg. I'm an Iranian, but I was raised in a family where my mother was Roman Catholic, my father was Muslim, so this is not a very common thing in Iran. So people might think that I come from the same culture that the other Iranian person is coming from, and that would not make sense. Culture is something that you have to be really careful about. Each family has its own culture. It's not bound to a geographical place. Oh, I see. Okay.
Can I say something here? Actually, Nazanin has been amazing explaining. And
Thank you.
Just adding to something that she said, which is that we tell them to interpret meaning for meaning, so it's not word for word. So that must be a little bit of a comfort. But the other thing is that when you're interpreting, when you're talking in English, you're not going to have a perfect conversation, right? So the expectation somehow that when you have an interpreter, the conversation has to be absolutely 100% perfect is unrealistic. So people who are English speaking, raised in this country, may not understand legal jargon, and yet they're communicating with people at a different language level. So the role of the interpreter is to normalize the communication and not to make it absolutely 100% perfect that everybody can understand, because then you're reading somebody else's mind and trying to figure out what it is that they didn't understand, right? So,
and I want to hold on to this one for when we all bring it in, because I think there's lots here to talk about. So Craig, you got, and then you're gonna go. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking right now at a story that came out October 22nd, and it was about the controversy over the imam at the masjid downtown, who had said, and it was a translation issue, death to all Jews for desecrating Al-Aqsa. And that ended up not being what was said, and then there was this big controversy back and forth. And that's because that's still a story that's out there. It's a hook for any of the journalism students that want to tell a story. And what's fascinating is I'm going through this, all the people that are brought out for translation, and people are picking who is going to tell the side of it that they wanted, but not a single one of them was a day-to-day translator. It was an academic that does some studies that might have knowledge of the language. So there's definitely a lead into a story with this that can be the importance of looking at translation, not just from the academic side, from the practical side, which is what you guys do. And then the citizens need to start thinking a little bit more critically about what they're getting and digging a bit more to this. And that could be a lead for you guys.
And I think we need to teach the differences between translation and interpretation for sure, because even in news in BBC, I sometimes hear that this translator who was working with the American troops, and then I read and I see, no, their job role was interpreter. They were not a translator, because there's definitely a difference of a role. And I still see that in Al Jazeera and BBC, and that's very heartbreaking because they're supposed to be the professional.
However, in some languages, there is only one word that means, there's only one word and it encompasses both interpreter and translator. So that's why we use interpretation.
Yeah. But in English, we have interpretation. And even in Farsi, it used to be translator, but now we have added verbal translator to that. And that's because we learned that from Western media, that, oh yeah, translation and verbal translation can be really different.
Okay, I'm going to get Nicole, is that right?
Jasmine.
Jasmine. Nicole's not here.
You keep saying Nicole. Who is Nicole?
Nicole, it was Nicole Sherry Adam. Nicole Sherry Adam. She is your other journalist. Nicole Sherry Adam. I was memorizing it on Friday. Jasmine, so we're going to give you the last word, and then we're going to reorganize the chairs here and sort of bring it in to have a little bit of a chat before we wrap up. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I had the opportunity to work with this group yesterday, and one of the things that I found really intriguing about this topic in particular was that, obviously intersectionality of being an immigrant and having a language marginalization adds a barrier to justice. But I think that when we look at it through this lens, we see that translation services can actually become a resource for addressing what's really a universal problem, the dropout rate amongst domestic violence complainants, right? So here, while translation is an added obstacle to justice, it can be an intervening factor to encouraging people to pursue their legal rights, right? So MCIS provides translation services, but at the same time, as an immigrant support organization, it can provide that intervening support, that intervening information that might make a victim more willing to go through with the full process.
Yeah.
And that's an opportunity that we don't actually have for the general population, right? So this intersectionality can be leveraged as a resource.
Absolutely. And also Latha could actually give us her, I don't see her, but maybe the ghost of Latha. Eliana? Okay. Oh, yeah, there you go. Maybe she can elaborate on what I have to say, but I guess MCIS sort of worked with this philosophy that we cannot change the world around us necessarily, but we can change us. So instead of just focusing on educating the victim or the people that are using our services, we developed this training program that focuses on our interpreters and gives them continued competency programs, gives them intense training. And I remember when I was getting trained, I had a full session of just interpreting obscenities and getting that out of my system, just so I am interpreting everything word by word, just so there's no meaning lost in translation. So that's very good, because in some cultures, women would not say a single word of obscenity. And that's just, imagine you're giving a statement to the police and you're talking about sexual abuse and you don't want to use obscenities, then where's that statement gonna go?
Right. Latha, do you want to have a final word before we go? No, you're good? Agreed.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
I think,
and I wanted to thank my team too, thank you.
Yeah, nicely done. I think it's interpretation hack sounds like a possible offshoot of this work. It's its own thing. Okay, so how about take a break and see if you want coffee or a drink or any other food, and we're going to reorganize the chairs here to get in a bit of a circle, and then we'll have a quick chat, and then off we go. Okay, so grab some stuff and we'll organize up here.